Someone had known exactly where to dig, exactly what they were searching for, and exactly when Tony wouldn't be around to see it. That meant this wasn't random. This was calculated. The disturbed ground. Tony had been patrolling the eastern edge of Paradise Hill, a remote section he rarely checked because the ground was rough and old geological reports had always shown low gold potential there. Still, claim boundaries had to be walked occasionally, and Tony took pride in knowing every inch of the land he'd fought so hard to secure. The first hole stopped him cold. The pile of overburden was fresh, soil that hadn't had time to settle or weather. Someone had dug here very recently. Within days, judging by the loose dirt, he approached carefully, mind racing through explanations that didn't add up. The hole was too clean for animals, too purposeful for natural erosion. Roughly 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, professional work. Someone had brought machinery, most likely a small excavator judging by the track marks, and removed the overburden methodically to reach pay dirt, but the real chill came from the location. This pit sat almost directly above the spot where Tony's private geological surveys from 3 years earlier had suggested a possible channel extension. Data that lived only in his locked files, information he'd never shared beyond his immediate family. Either this was an unbelievable coincidence, or someone had access to information they had no right to have. Tony pulled out his radio. "Mike, get to the eastern boundary, section 12. Bring a camera." "What's wrong?" "Someone's been mining our claim." And they knew exactly where to dig. While he waited, Tony discovered 2 more holes within 100 yards, all showing the same signature: fresh digging, precise targeting, professional execution. This wasn't amateur theft. This was organized. This was informed. Mike arrived 20 minutes later. His face went from curious to furious as he took in the scene. They documented everything: photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates. The evidence painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Water disturbance near the creek and piles of processed tailings showed the intruders had brought portable washing equipment. "They're processing on site," Mike said quietly. "Taking the gold, leaving the waste behind. That's not casual. That's sophisticated." Tony's jaw tightened. 40 years building this operation. And someone was simply walking onto his ground and taking what he'd earned through decades of work. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was violation. "We need the RCMP," Mike said. "This is organized crime." Tony nodded slowly, already facing the implications neither of them wanted to say out loud. If the thieves knew exactly where to dig, someone had fed them the information. Someone he trusted had betrayed him. The pattern emerges looking back. Tony realized the warning signs had been there for weeks, small things he dismissed as coincidence or oversight. But now, viewed through the lens of deliberate theft, they formed a clear and chilling pattern. It started in late July with fuel discrepancies. Minnie, who handled the operations books with meticulous care, had pointed out that diesel usage was running higher than expected based on logged equipment hours. Not wildly higher, maybe 10 to 15%, but enough to notice in a tight margin operation where waste was unacceptable. Could be poor quality fuel, Tony had suggested. Burns faster, less efficient. Could be, Minnie agreed, though her tone said she wasn't convinced. But we've used the same supplier for 5 years without this issue. Tony had made a mental note to follow up, but other fires demanded attention: a wash plant breakdown at 60 Mile, crew scheduling conflicts, constant pressure to hit production targets. The fuel anomaly slipped lower on his list, something to deal with when things calmed down. Then in early August, Kevin, head mechanic, mentioned that equipment sometimes seemed to have been moved overnight. "Nothing huge," he said during a routine maintenance meeting, "but the excavator at Paradise Hill, I swear I left it facing north yesterday evening, and this morning it was facing west. Could have been someone else repositioning it, but nobody said anything. Who else would move it? Tony asked. Kevin shrugged. That's what I'm wondering. Just seemed odd. Again, Tony filed it away. Large operations with multiple crews always had communication gaps. Maybe someone needed better access and forgot to mention it. Not worth turning into drama. The third clue came from Mike in mid-August. He'd been reviewing security camera footage from the main shop area, checking timestamps for an insurance claim, when he noticed a truck entering the property around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The angle and lighting made identification hard, but the vehicle looked like one of the crew trucks. Probably someone forgot something and came back for it, Mike told Tony. But the weird part is they didn't go to the shop. They drove straight toward the eastern boundary, and the camera doesn't cover that far. Which crew member? Can't tell from this footage. Could be 3 or 4 different guys with similar trucks. Tony made another mental note to ask around, but never did. The season was in full swing, days were long, and chasing down which crew member had briefly returned to the claim in the middle of the night for unknown reasons hadn't felt urgent compared to actual mining. Now, standing beside holes that proved someone had been systematically stealing from his ground, all those small red flags snapped into focus. The fuel discrepancies. Someone filling their own equipment for night work. The moved machinery. Either the thieves using his gear or crew members repositioning things to hide activity. The late-night truck visit? Reconnaissance or coordination? How had he missed it? Tony Beets, the man who'd built his reputation on noticing every detail, on running a tight ship where nothing slipped past him, had somehow overlooked evidence that would have been obvious if he'd been paying closer attention. The uncomfortable truth: he'd been stretched too thin. Running multiple claims across huge distances, managing dozens of employees, balancing production demands with equipment breakdowns and crew morale, dealing with investors, regulators, and 1,000 other responsibilities. He'd built an empire too big for one man to watch every corner, and someone had exploited that unavoidable blind spot. Worse still, the level of sophistication pointed to inside knowledge. The timing of when to dig, the exact locations of pay dirt, the understanding of when Tony and his core team wouldn't be in that part of the claim. Only someone with intimate operational insight could have planned this. The investigation deepens. The RCMP's forensic examination of the sites took most of the day, and every new detail made the situation worse. Footprint casts suggested at least 3 different individuals had been working the holes. Tool marks on the pit walls showed professional mining experience, not amateur trial and error. Most disturbing, small traces of gold in the processed tailings confirmed the thieves had recovered color. They'd correctly identified pay-bearing gravel. They knew exactly what they were doing, Constable Morrison said as he packed up his evidence kit. This wasn't exploratory. They had specific targets and extracted material efficiently. That level of precision requires geological data. Tony and Mike walked the sites again after the RCMP left, this time searching for anything that might reveal the scale of the operation or the people behind it. What they found was both revealing and terrifying. Track marks indicated a small excavator, probably in the 20-ton range, big enough to move material quickly, small enough to trailer in and out. Water flow patterns showed they'd used a portable trommel or sluice box, equipment that could be set up and torn down fast, and cigarette butts near one hole, common litter, but also the first potential source of DNA evidence if they could ever match it to anyone. We should test everyone on the crew, Mike suggested. Compare DNA from those cigarette butts. Tony shook his head. Can't do that without consent. And asking for consent is basically accusing them all. That'll destroy morale and make the guilty person, if they're on our crew, disappear deeper underground. So what do? We watch. We wait. And we figure out who has access to information they shouldn't have. Back at the main shop, Tony and Mike began the painful process of reviewing access. Who had seen the geological surveys? Who knew the property boundaries well enough to navigate at night? Who had the skills to operate mining equipment professionally? The list was uncomfortably long. Kevin, head mechanic, had access to everything, including Tony's office where surveys were stored. He also had the skills to run any piece of equipment on the property and detailed knowledge of the claims. But Kevin had been with Tony for 15 years, had earned increasing responsibility, and had never shown any sign of dishonesty. Several excavator operators had the technical ability and knowledge, but varying levels of access to sensitive data. Any of them could navigate the property at night, but did they know where the surveys showed good ground? That information was supposed to be restricted to Tony's immediate family and senior management. Even newer crew members couldn't be completely ruled out. Someone could be acting as an inside facilitator, providing minor help like unlocking gates or sharing schedules in exchange for a cut of the stolen gold. We're going in circles, Mike said after 2 hours of speculation. We can't investigate everyone without tipping off whoever's actually involved. Tony rubbed his face, exhaustion and frustration clear. Then we do what I should have done weeks ago. We pay attention. We watch patterns. Notice who's where when. Track behavior changes. That's going to take time. Season's more than half over. Then we also set a trap, Tony said slowly, an idea taking shape. We create an opportunity that's too good to pass up. Control the conditions. Watch who takes the bait. Mike studied his father's expression. You mean use ourselves as bait? Let them think we found something valuable, and see who shows up. Something like that. But carefully. These people, whoever they are, have already proven they're organized and informed. If we're too obvious, they'll smell the setup. The plan took shape over the next few days. They selected another remote section of the claim, one that geological surveys suggested might hold good ground but hadn't been actively worked yet. They made sure certain crew members overheard conversations about planning test holes in that area. They left marked-up maps visible in Tony's office during moments when the room was empty, but actually monitored. Most importantly, they installed a network of trail cameras with night vision and motion detection throughout the target zone, concealed well enough that casual observers wouldn't notice, but positioned to capture anyone who appeared after dark. Feels like we're in a spy movie, Mike said as they placed the last camera. Feels like desperation, Tony replied. Never thought I'd be setting traps for my own crew. The RCMP agreed to monitor the feeds remotely and stage officers nearby in case the thieves showed up, but Constable Morrison was clear about the limits. We can respond if we see activity, but response time to your location is at least 20 minutes. If these people spook easily, they'll be gone before we get there. So we need to catch them in the act, Tony said carefully, and somehow keep them on site until you arrive. Morrison emphasized again, these aren't kids joyriding, Mr. Beets. They're organized. They know what they're doing. And they might be armed. Don't confront them alone. Don't try to be a hero. Your job is to confirm identity and keep them there until we arrive. The waiting was harder than Tony expected. Every night he monitored the camera feeds from his cabin, watching empty wilderness, seeing nothing but occasional wildlife tripping motion sensors. Every morning he checked with crew members about whether anyone had mentioned the target area or shown unusual interest in that section of the claim. The operations atmosphere remained tense despite his earlier apology. Some crew members had accepted it and returned to normal working relationships. Others stayed distant, professionally correct, but no longer emotionally invested beyond their specific duties. Kevin had stayed, but with obvious reluctance, making it clear he was finishing the season out of commitment to the crew rather than loyalty to Tony. On the 8th night, at 2:47 a.m., Tony's phone buzzed with an alert from the camera system: motion detected. Multiple heat signatures. Equipment sounds. That he grabbed his radio and called Mike. "They're here. Get the RCMP on the line and meet me at the staging area." The staging area was a concealed position about a quarter-mile from the target site, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid detection. Tony and Mike reached it within 10 minutes, using night vision equipment to watch the scene unfolding below. 3 people were working efficiently with a small excavator and portable sluice box, exactly the setup they'd hypothesized. 2 operated equipment while the third ran material through the sluice, moving with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this many times before. "Can you identify anyone?" Mike whispered. Tony studied the figures through night vision, trying to match body language and movement patterns with people he knew, and then one of them moved into better camera range, removing his jacket in a way that revealed both his build and his distinctive movements. Tony felt his stomach drop. He knew that person. Had worked with him for over 3 years. Had trusted him with increasingly important responsibilities. Had defended him when other crew members questioned his commitment. "That's Brad," Tony said quietly, naming one of his excavator operators. "The one on the sluice?" "That's definitely Brad." Mike trained his binoculars on the scene. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Worked with him long enough to recognize how he moves." Tony's voice was tight with anger and betrayal. "Don't recognize the other 2, but Brad's definitely ours." The RCMP arrived 20 minutes later, approaching with lights off until they were close enough to prevent escape. What followed happened quickly. Lights suddenly flooded the scene. Officers identifying themselves. The 3 thieves freezing in surprise before 2 tried to run and were quickly apprehended. Brad didn't run. He just stood there, caught in the spotlight, looking up toward where he somehow knew Tony was watching. Processing took hours. Brad and his accomplices were arrested. Equipment was seized as evidence. Constable Morrison documented everything methodically. Tony gave his statement, identified Brad as his employee, and confirmed that none of the 3 had authorization to be on the property or to mine any material. As dawn broke and the RCMP prepared to transport the suspects, Morrison pulled Tony aside. "Brad's talking," he said. "Says he's been working with these other 2 for about 6 weeks. Provided geological information in exchange for a cut of the recovered gold. Claims he needed money for medical bills his insurance wouldn't cover. That's supposed to make it okay?" Tony's voice was hard. "No. It's supposed to explain motivation. Doesn't justify anything, but it explains." As the RCMP vehicles disappeared down the rough road, Tony stood with Mike watching the sunrise over Paradise Hill. They'd caught 1 thief. They'd recovered some stolen equipment. They'd proven the operation wasn't as secure as Tony had believed, but they'd also confirmed that someone he trusted, someone he'd mentored and defended, had betrayed him systematically for money. And that reality hurt worse than any amount of stolen gold. The reckoning the week after Brad's arrest was the longest of Tony's mining career. The story spread through the Klondike mining community at lightning speed, discussed in shops, bars, and equipment yards across the territory. Opinions varied. Some sympathized with Tony. Others suggested he'd been naive to trust crew members so completely. What bothered Tony most wasn't the gossip, it was the questions he couldn't answer. Was Brad the only one? Had others been involved that they hadn't caught? Could he trust anyone on his crew anymore? Crew morale had deteriorated further after the arrest. Those who'd been friendly with Brad felt betrayed and angry. Those who'd never liked him felt vindicated, but also anxious about being suspected themselves. Everyone moved through their work with careful neutrality, trying not to draw attention. Many approached Tony in his office one evening. Financial reports spread across the desk. We need to talk about next season. I know. Budget's tight after this mess. That's not what I mean. Minnie set down her calculator. I mean, we need to talk about whether there is a next season, whether this operation can continue functioning under the weight of constant suspicion and surveillance. Tony looked at his wife, his partner through 4 decades of building this mining empire. You think we should shut down? I think you need to decide what kind of operation you want to run. Because right now you're running a prison where everyone's a potential suspect and nobody trusts anyone. That's not sustainable, Tony. That's not the empire you built. So what do I do? Just let people steal from me? No. But you stop letting the thieves win by destroying what made this operation special in the first place. Minnie gestured toward the window, toward Paradise Hill stretching out in the gathering darkness. You built this on trust and loyalty and treating people well. One person betrayed that. Maybe a few people. But most of your crew is still loyal, still trustworthy, still working hard despite being treated like criminals. I haven't treated them like criminals. Haven't you? The cameras, the restricted access, the constant watching, the suspicion in every conversation. That's not management, Tony. That's surveillance. And it's destroying the culture that made people want to work here. Tony was quiet for a long time, processing truths he'd been avoiding. He'd spent weeks focused on catching thieves and preventing theft, but he'd lost sight of what made his operation valuable in the first place. It wasn't just the gold, the equipment, or even the land. It was the culture he'd built, the relationships he'd fostered, the loyalty he'd earned through decades of treating people fairly. Brad's betrayal had hurt that culture badly. But Tony's response, his descent into suspicion and surveillance, had hurt it worse. The next morning Tony called another crew meeting, the final one. He decided, before making changes that would either save the operation's soul or prove it was already too damaged to recover. We caught Brad, Tony began without preamble. He confessed. He'll face charges and he won't work in this industry again. That part's over. Nods around the circle, some satisfied, some still angry. But what's not over is what his betrayal did to us, to how we work together, how we trust each other, how this operation functions. Tony paused, making eye contact with crew members he'd worked alongside for years. I handled this wrong. Let that betrayal turn me into someone I'm not. Let it make me suspicious of everyone. Made me treat loyal people like criminals. Turned this operation into something that looks more like a prison than a mining crew. Kevin watched him carefully, expression unreadable. So here's what's changing. We're pulling most of the cameras, keeping only the perimeter security that any operation should have, but eliminating the internal surveillance. We're going back to open access for senior crew on geological data and operational planning. We're returning to running this operation based on trust rather than suspicion. And if someone else steals from you, one crew member asked, then they steal from me, and we deal with it when it happens. But I'm not going to destroy what makes this operation work just to prevent something that might never happen again. Tony's voice was firm. I built this on trust and loyalty. Brad betrayed that, and he's paying the price. But I'm not going to let one person's betrayal destroy what dozens of good people have built over decades. The tension that had defined every crew interaction for weeks didn't vanish completely, but it cracked. People who'd been defensive relaxed slightly. Conversation started happening again instead of silence. after the meeting Kevin approached Tony. That took courage. Took Minnie telling me I was being an idiot, Tony replied. But yeah, felt like jumping off a cliff, trusting people again after being betrayed. Trust is always a jump, Kevin said. But it's the only way operations like ours work. We're too spread out, too dependent on people making good decisions independently. If you can't trust your crew, you can't run this kind of operation. So you staying? Kevin was quiet for a moment. Yeah. I'm staying. Because what you said in there, about not letting one person's betrayal destroy decades of building something good, that's the Tony Beets I signed up to work for. Took you a while to remember that, but you got there. As the season wound toward its close and the first serious snows threatened Paradise Hill, Tony reflected on what the whole ordeal had cost, and what it had taught him. They'd recovered some stolen gold. They'd caught one thief. They'd proven their security had serious vulnerabilities, but they'd also learned harder lessons about trust, betrayal, and the delicate culture that made large operations function. The surveillance equipment mostly came down. Restricted access mostly ended. The operation gradually returned to something resembling its previous rhythm, though everyone understood it would never be exactly the same. Brad's betrayal had left scars, and scars don't fully heal, but scars also serve as reminders. Reminders to stay vigilant without becoming paranoid. Reminders to trust carefully but genuinely. Reminders that building something valuable requires accepting vulnerability, because the alternative is building nothing worth having. On the final day of operations before winter shutdown, Tony stood on the ridge overlooking Paradise Hill, watching his crew secure equipment and prepare for the long, cold months ahead. Some would return next season. Others wouldn't, having decided to work for operations with less drama and fewer complications, but enough would return. Enough loyal, trustworthy people who understood what Tony had been trying to build, and wanted to be part of it, and that, ultimately, was what mattered more than gold, security systems, or catching every potential thief. Tony Beets had spent 40 years building an empire. Brad's betrayal had threatened to destroy it, not through theft, but through the paranoia and suspicion that followed. But in choosing to return to trust despite the risks, in choosing to preserve culture over control, Tony had saved something more valuable than any amount of gold. He'd saved the soul of Paradise Hill, and in the Klondike, where gold was precious but trust was priceless, that was the only thing worth fighting for. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And before you go, make sure to check out the other videos playing on your screen right now.